This is the flour real ninjas use to make cakes, cookies, and martabak manis. It's clearly a low-protein flour, not a Japanese flour. It's just called ninja for whatever reason. Okay. This video is obviously not about ninjas. Instead, we're going to be seriously talking about wheat flour. Wheat flour is the most essential ingredient for a baker, but sometimes it can be easily overlooked. So here we have several types of wheat flour I regularly use. They are readily accessible from the baking aisle of most local supermarkets. While there are so many on this table, to the flour classification system we have here, there are literally only 3 categories of flour: high protein, medium protein, and low protein wheat flours. The majority of wheat flour here is processed into noodles. The market for wheat flour, other than that, is similar to a subset of the types sold in the United States. For example, this one is meant to be used as bread flour with the label mentioning bread and indicating a protein content within the right range of a bread flour, so around 13% here. Aside from the bread flour, this one is basically all-purpose flour, and this one is supposed to be used for cake and pastry. We also have a few more flours from different brands under the same classification system. They are meant for the same purposes. Now, looking at just the protein content and label, it's easy to jump into the conclusion that a certain flour is quote-unquote compatible to a particular type of flour in the US or any other part of the world for that matter. But the thing is, it's not all about protein content. Yes, protein content is absolutely important, but relying squarely only on the protein content of a flour to make your choice can be misleading. And this is what I wanted to delve into. Flour may have the same appearance, may even have the same label mentioning the exact same amount of protein content, yet they can still be significantly different from each other. Sometimes this difference is the main reason why it's so hard to get a recipe's expected outcome. To talk about flour, we need to start from the grain. Starting from the first layer, the outer part covering the kernel is the bran. It's about 14% of the kernel total weight. Bran is hard and sharp, so flours with a lot of bran in them may make for denser breads due to the bran damaging the gluten strands. It contains insoluble dietary fiber, small amounts of protein, and trace minerals. You may find it being sold in the supermarket like this under the name of wheat bran. Next, at the center, we have the endosperm that makes up the majority of the kernel total weight, 83%. In nature, this part of the kernel provides nourishment to the growing embryo during germination. But when made into white wheat flour, it provides us with protein, carbohydrates, iron, and B vitamins. The last part of the wheat kernel is the germ, about 2.5% of the kernel total weight. This is the embryo or sprouting section of the seed. It contains some high-quality protein, trace minerals, B-complex vitamins, and fat. About 10% of it is fat. This part is usually removed because it limits the shelf life of processed wheat flour and it can interfere with gluten development. This means whole wheat flours have a shorter shelf life and may produce denser breads compared to other white wheat flours. Most of the wheat flour you'll see on shelves, like all-purpose, cake flour, or bread flour, are made mainly from the endosperm. Wheat grains have specific characteristics depending on where and how the wheat is grown and its variety. In this video, we won't go into too much detail about the wheat varieties, but in short, there are 2 distinct varieties to know: soft and hard. Soft wheat refers to wheat with kernels that break down more easily and readily, making it easier to mill into flour, while hard wheats require more energy to turn into flour. Stronger and higher protein flours, such as bread flours with about 11 to 13% protein content, usually come from hard wheat, whereas soft wheats, on the other hand, tend to be used for weaker flours such as cake flours that have a protein content of around 9% or less. Modern milling procedures are capable of breaking up and separating wheat grains into the finer and coarser parts made up of the bran, endosperm, and germ. After being milled, the grains come out as flour streams that vary in compositions and quality. And the combination of these flour streams produce the flours we buy and also the ones fed to livestock. During the milling process, it is much easier to damage the starches in hard wheat rather than soft wheat because the harder kernels are more brittle, and when grinded at higher pressures, they have much less risk of overheating or bran contamination. They tend to fracture more. This is important to know because damaged starch can absorb several times more water than undamaged starch, which means flour made from hard wheat with more starch damage can absorb more water than soft wheat flour. This is why hard wheat flour is often preferred for bread baking rather than soft wheat flour. Soft wheat flour, with its lower starch damage and lower ability to absorb water, is preferred for making biscuits or cookies, where a lower moisture content is actually beneficial to the end product. Now, besides soft and hard, there's another thing to know: extraction rate. Extraction rate is the percentage of the kernel that is turned into flour. So if a flour has a 100% extraction rate, it uses the entire kernel, so it's basically a whole wheat flour. Flours are graded based on this extraction rate, with the highest grade being patent flour. This flour contains the lowest amount of bran and germ. It is also extracted during the first streams of milling. As you might expect, patent flour has a low extraction rate, somewhere under 65%, because it excludes most of the bran and germ. Due to this exclusion, patent flour typically contains less protein overall, but the protein it does contain is better in quality. It's also normally the whitest and finest out of the other flours, and when made with soft wheat, used for cake flour. The streams of flour not used for patent flour are called clear flour or low-grade flour. These are usually higher in bran and germ, so it's usually darker in color too. Now, when all flour streams are combined, including the patent flour and clear flour, we call it straight flour. While patent flour is considered the highest grade, some artisan bakers prefer a higher ash content or higher extraction rate for the flour because they find the taste to be better due to the extra bran and germ, especially when it undergoes long fermentation. The white wheat flour you get at the store is probably one of or a mixture of these flours, and the rest of the wheat grain is normally processed into something else, including as livestock feed. Unless, of course, you're using whole wheat flour, in which case the entire grain is used. When all these flours make it to the store, it's often not clear exactly which grade the flour is. The best way to find out is, of course, to ask the millers, but if that's not possible, there's also a quick way to have a guess at the grade with the ash content. Now, let me be clear, there is no ash in flour until you burn it. The ashes of the burned flour are then measured and normally presented in percentages. Usually the higher the ash content, the higher the flour extraction rate, because there's more of that heavier bran and germ. What this can directly mean for your bread is if you use a flour with more ash content due to the extra bran and germ, you might have to add more water and let it rest for longer to let the bran and germ soak. The bread could also be darker in color and possibly denser thanks to the gluten interference. I would like to say, though, that ash content can be misleading. Depending on how the wheat plant was grown, it may have resulted in a higher mineral content in the grain, so a higher ash content could be a reflection of these minerals rather than bran and germ contamination in the flour. Now, in the US and many other countries, ash content isn't really talked about. It's certainly not found on the packaging of many flours, although it can occasionally be found by looking for it on the miller's website. It's a completely different situation than in France and some other countries in Europe, where the flour is labeled according to a numbered type system based on ash content, such as the French T55 or T45. Although it's important to know that the way ash content is measured in Europe is a little different from the American standard of measuring it. In Europe, the flour's ash content is measured based on the dry matter of the flour, whereas in the US it's measured on a 14% moisture basis. This is important to consider when trying to use an American flour for a recipe using a European one. Of course, that's not the only difference between European flours and flours in the US. Wheat in Europe also tends to be softer and lower in protein. The flour might also have a higher extraction rate with more bran and germ. Seeing as there are so many delicious and popular European breads, I think these are all important to take into consideration. I think it's part of why many people who have tasted a truly great European bread can find it so difficult to bake the same bread elsewhere. This is actually something I've struggled with myself when baking baguettes and other breads. As a bit of a backdrop, while wheat does grow in a variety of environments, it doesn't grow very well in a tropical and humid environment. That's why here, wheat is mostly imported from other countries, including the US and Australia. From what I've found, the flour I used tended towards the harder side, being very high in protein and readily forming incredible gluten strength, while also being very refined and low in bran and germ. When trying recipes from the US, it was relatively easy to find the flour I needed, even if it wasn't perfectly similar. But with certain bread recipes such as baguettes, it was a little different, and even after making a successful bread, it wouldn't taste just right. Now, I won't claim to have solved this or that you can perfectly bake any recipe. I am still experimenting, but after much research, there are a few things we can do to get a closer outcome to these European recipes. So one of the important points is naturally to try to find a flour with a similar ash content and protein content to the flour in the European recipe as you can. But as I mentioned earlier, you have to watch out for the different ways of measuring the ash content. And it turns out this can also apply to protein content. Like ash content, protein content in the US can be represented on a 14% moisture basis, whereas in Europe, it's normally measured on a dry basis. So say if a flour has 10% protein in the US, that could mean it's actually a flour with 11% protein in European standards. So when picking out the right flour for your recipe, you have to be aware that this might happen and make sure to properly check your flour's information. Another important thing to pay attention to is the composition of soft and hard wheat in your flour. European wheat flours tend to be made of more soft wheat, so if you have a high protein, hard wheat flour on hand and you're trying to make a European bread, it may be a good idea to mix in a softer wheat flour like a cake flour or an all-purpose flour. The change this makes goes back to when we talked about the differences between hard and soft wheat, which were quite substantial. The last point I want to add is a little more about taste and appearance. Flours in Europe are known to typically have a slightly higher extraction rate. If your flour is extremely refined, very pale, and your bread is a little bit lacking in color and flavor, then you might want to add a little bit of whole wheat flour to give it some of that bran and germ back. You might have to make certain adjustments to the recipe time and add a bit more water though. All these points are more of a starting point for adapting your flour to match the recipes. You're probably still going to have to experiment with the exact ratios and methods. You'll probably also have to adjust the hydration of the recipes. For this kind of experimentation, it'll naturally be best if you know exactly what kind of flour you have on hand, especially the key metrics I talked about earlier. And if you can't get them, well, have fun baking and keep trying. And that's it for today. Thanks for watching and bye!